Okay. Hello, Usman Hamid.
How are you doing?
I'm doing very good. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me today. I've been to some of your classes, it's a lot of fun. And I was wondering, my first question, it's a pretty thick question, but could you give me like a brief rundown of the big moments in your academic history? Like when did you first get interested in the subject?
Right.
Was it, during some sort of schooling, or what are the big moments for you?
Yeah, in my undergrad, I was a marketing major, and I enjoyed some of my thing. I enjoyed advertising. I enjoyed sort of the creative elements of it, but it wasn't the right path for me. I sort of realized that while I was doing my degree and I was working for an insurance company or insurance brokerage while I was doing my undergrad. And so I started taking electives, and I took sort of survey of English literature. I took, and then one of the courses I ended up taking was this history of early Islamic history. I got really interested in that. History, and this same professor was going to be offering a year-long course on medieval history next year, medieval Islamic history. So I took that, and then I realized, this is what I enjoy. And so then I just ended up taking a lot more history courses. And at McGill, I was part of this Middle East and Islamic Studies program. So you had to sort of balance history courses out with courses on culture and religion, social science courses on poli-sci and anthropology, as well as a certain amount of language training in your undergrad. So I did that, and then for my master's I stayed at McGill, and I ended up focusing on 16th century Indian history for my master's, for my thesis. I ended up working on eunuchs in Mughal India, and then came here to do my PhD. And so that's kind of been my journey, I suppose you could say.
Cool. So just a little dabbling in marketing. Did you have like a career in that, or just an interest, or
in marketing?
Or
well, I initially came to the program because I think they were developing a program, or they had a program that sort of went defunct in business psychology.
Oh.
And so consumer behavior, and I enjoyed that, and I was I enjoyed that, but it wasn't my passion, I suppose you could say, or it didn't stimulate me as much, or maybe the fit wasn't right there.
So whatever interests you might have had in that were certainly outweighed by these interesting cultures.
Yeah, definitely. I think I do. There were a certain amount of skills that came from my business background that I find helpful now. So organizing conferences, talks, thinking about budgets. Also, there's a lot of group work in business programs, just because the class sizes are bigger, and so every class you have about 40 to 60% of your grade dependent on a 5-person group project, and so that teaches you interpersonal skills in a way that I don't think, it's a crash course in interpersonal skills and working with people.
I think communication skills must have been important because, from the way you lecture, I think you convey a lot of your interest in the subjects whenever we're, talking about, a certain geographical area or the art and history of it. Are there specific, so you've researched a lot of historical periods, are there specific parts of cultures that you find interesting, like more the art or the people moving around? Or?
I think I've always been interested in social and cultural history. I think political history is important because people view it as important. In South Asia today, the history of the pre-modern or the pre-colonial period is fairly contested. I mean, there's a real stake in how do you present this, because it affects how people locally are seeing politics. So, for instance, in the creation of Pakistan, there was a real investment in sort of outlining that there were always two nations in South Asia. There were Muslims and then there were Hindus. And so there's a very particular kind of narrative that's created to sort of justify a nation state for Muslims in South Asia in the form of Pakistan. And then, in India, there is, again, a sort of investment from different sites, because you'll have sort of more Marxist-oriented scholars who, the ones who did not sort of see the pre-modern period as just sort of despotism, sort of saw in the early modern period a kind of ecumenical rule that was proto-secular nationalist. Right? And that's the kind of claim that some of them have made. Well, this is kind of like the nationalist school of historiography in South Asia that gets collapsed with Marxism and stuff. But then there's another school that sort of sees from the rise, from the sort of beginnings of Muslim rule, a kind of colonialism from then, right? And so the colonial period doesn't start with the British colonial rule, but it starts with Muslim colonial rule. And so the creation of India is specifically as a kind of a country which is, secular, but is a country for Hindus. It's like sort of like Hindu nationalism sort of sees a long period of colonialism with Islam. So, this has always been kind of interesting, and issues that sort of come up, like for instance, desecration of sacred spaces, conversion to Islam, the rise of Sikhism. These issues still matter today, and they're still sort of invoked in everyday discourse, whether that's newspapers or sort of popular history. But even more so, I've noticed like there's been a real resurgence of these issues online. In sort of, if you're looking for videos for history, if you look at the YouTube comments, it's actually a very helpful exercise to just sort of see what people's positions are. So like, why history, what is at stake in history? And so that's always interested me. I got interested more in the pre-colonial period than the colonial period. There's this. I was always interested in the pre-colonial just because of the art and sort of, the Mughal dynasty was very big cultural patrons. So it's hard not to sort of see a certain kind of, with their monuments and their paintings. But, in the recent years, there's been a lot of interest in the colonial period, and sort of seeing the colonial period as a period of transformation or rupture in South Asia, the way people imagined languages, religion. And so people have sort of posed the question, well, we understand that something changed in the colonial period, but what did it change from, right? And so that's kind of like why I'm interested in sort of the pre-modern period, or the period right before colonialism, the couple of centuries before that.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Have you been interested much in even before that? I don't know if you're interested in this, but a while ago I read, I think it was Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond.
Right.
And I find definitely the social and cultural, happenings very interesting. But of course, talking about more modern, colonial and post, colonial or mid-colonial, but also how those peoples emerged in the first place.
Yeah. It's not my specialization, or it's areas that I don't know as much about. It's interesting because the archaeological sort of work, or people's interest in archaeology, is that itself is sort of contested too, because the question sort of comes up is, was there some sort of migration of peoples who brought Vedic culture to South Asia, right? And so there is, it's interesting, it's no aspect of South Asian history is not political.
Yeah, oh yeah, especially today when, yeah, as you said, online, there's lots of different, educational sources and resources getting discussed. And identity is such a big issue, and I mean, I think it's such a unique and special, that's why I love doing this project specifically on the campus, because, seeing different people from different backgrounds, you get all these different understandings of identity and how that's constructed. And do you think for you, like, it's been very important in understanding, like, the, how people constructed their identity in the society? Has that tied into your own interest in how you might see a personal history in these places?
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about history is that, to sort of paraphrase Mary Beard, who works on the ancient Rome, she's had a series of really great documentaries on ancient Rome, and so she sort of says that you're kind of having a conversation with the past about the present, right? And so right now issues of cosmopolitanism, identity are kind of in the forefront, and so I see. I enjoy looking into the past, or sort of having a conversation with the past, and see how people imagine identity then. One of the topics that sort of has become really popular nowadays is histories of encounter in South Asia, right? And I think that's partly because we are, most of the people who are doing this work are globalized people in North America. Whether people originated from South Asia or North America, but I think we're kind of living this global moment, and sort of this moment of sort of encountering new cultures, foods, literatures, and so people are so historians, I think, are interested in sort of looking at how similar experiences were had in the past, right? And how was identity formation taking place in the early modern period? Just, I think, not to have a very clear, teleological background, maybe? I don't know. I have to think about that.
Yeah, no, certainly something I see in a bunch of cool anthropology courses about culture and migration is the idea of hybridity, and how often these days, we're interested in the past and where, different cultures come from, but it's because, so many encounters and so much, globalization has happened, identity becomes just a massive hybridity, and identifying like individual experiences and, finding some way to, celebrate or preserve them is, I find it interesting for a lot of different groups who try to revive identities through, looking up their own histories, or through, their degree, just being interested in a certain topic and finding their interest.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like two impulses there, right? There's one which is to sort of ossify some sort of past, which is this is the idealized past, and this is when we have to preserve these identities. But then there's another approach which you sort of go back and you see how identities were so contingent anyway in the past, right? And so that also gives you, I think that it's really a creative space then, right? If you look back and you think of the translation movements that took place when people translated from Sanskrit into Persian, or they sort of rewrote different narratives, or you had, Hindu scribal elites who sort of were very well versed in Sufi poetry, and had sort of were students of Sufi poets. You kind of realize that the sort of rigid categories that we sort of hope to find in history to justify the present. I'm sure you can find them, but you also find a lot of other kinds of identities or other kind of cultural positions that I think can be really interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, I think there's specific topics that like jump out as being especially more diverse and hybrid, like part of a sort of positive psychology project I'm working into. I'm looking at historical events that seem to characterize different character strengths and virtues, and one of them that pops up in my mind is as a place of like learning or possibly open-mindedness is the so-called golden age of Islam, and how you have a period that's especially marked by just different educational sources, different encounters being encouraged. But yeah, at any normal period in history, I imagine there's so much complexity to individuals and identities, and so many stories that are being dug up and recorded in one way or another. And these days are just in like such a flood of information with all these educational resources online in our own lives, in our own communities. And finding these unique historical roots to take to trace back these certain identities seems very interesting.
It's really exciting, isn't it, that we have access to this kind of information being disseminated in so many different kinds of media, right? So you've got, it's not just, history isn't just sort of the teaching in class. It's, whether it's histories retold through comics or movies or monuments or YouTube videos. It's actually, it's really interesting, and I think people sort of see, sometimes I think people can be sort of despondent about the past, but I think the past sort of, it's everywhere in a way, right? And so it's great that we have access to so much of the past online and what have you.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely have had differing views about this in the past because in my high school years, I wasn't the best sort of history student. I had a history teacher who I particularly, I did not enjoy that class. I didn't, none of it came alive for me. It was just a bunch of dead textbooks. It was just a bunch of like, footnotes to Canadian history that didn't seem too important. They just seemed almost like legally mandated, like, oh, you should learn this. But yeah, these days with all the different mediums, whether it's, YouTube video or, a really good documentary or interview of a set of people, especially, when you tie in the architecture and the geography, the history once again jumps to life, and it blends up to all these other cultural studies that I think a lot of people find very interesting these days to understanding their own identities.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder. I don't know the mechanics of this, but I wonder if it's from the time that you have cutting edge research to the time that it sort of filters down into publications, textbooks, and then sort of state syllabi or sort of national syllabi. I don't know what that timeline looks like, and sort of what are the different politics out there. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how sort of truth and reconciliation recommendations to have more First Nation content and sort of talk about sort of that, how that sort of filters into it, because I think that might be an interesting example. When you're teaching in the university, you're very fortunate in a way that you set your agenda, what you're going to teach. But I'll be honest, sometimes trying to find a textbook that is somewhat up to date on sort of the trends can be sometimes hard to find. Recently there's been a few really good ones. But other times you want to sort of suggest something for people to read, but you check it out and when you read it 10 years ago, it's relatively up to date, but now it's been 10 years since that book was published, or 12 years since that book was published, and sort of the field has sort of moved on and it's asking you questions. I'm somewhat sympathetic to that conundrum. Yes.
Yeah, I think the other part of it was just a large spite I had and still have for different methods of teaching, where one sort of sees a subject as like rote and dead. Like, this is a history textbook. It's presented to the student, and the student is expected to, like, see value in it, memorize it, as opposed to, of course, university classes, you finally get to, think more, engage more with the material, but also just use, it's sort of encouraged to judge the quality of the source. Because, like, when you're in high school and you just have this one textbook, it's certainly a very different experience from, like, the syllabus of the university, where in some sense you're almost, you're still given a list, but you're asking those critical questions, like, where does the source come from? What, how does this fit into other narratives? And in that, you're actually taking a more active role in your own education. And I love to see, that my opinion of history class has been totally, most classes have been totally changed at university. Because a lot of good lecturers and professors give you that opportunity to sort of understand the context, to give yourself a perspective and realize there's more than one. There's not just a grade 10 textbook.
I think what you just sort of said. I think in high school you're consuming history which has a project in a way, and I think history being taught in the university also has a project. I think every professor brings in their own sort of interests or what have you. But you're right. You're always being reminded to sort of read the text or read the sources, knowing that this has been constructed by someone, right? So whether that's a certain suspicion or a certain to get your spidey sense up to say that, okay, how is this argument being constructed? What evidence has the person brought? I think that's really empowering, right? So I think it's a much more engaged process, I think, and then and I think at a university level you present history. You have to present some sort of value in history. It's not a mandated course. So I think that can also be exciting, or I hope it's exciting. Though it's true, I have heard from many people that have said that history was not their most favorite subject in high school, but in university it became more dynamic, I guess. I don't know, right? Like it's sort of more engaged, as you said.
Yeah, I think communication goes a long way too. I don't know if that you can draw certain conclusions. I love to. There's a psychology part of me that would love to look at like the personality traits of different professors and different like subjects. But when like a professor in a history discipline can, or in any discipline, can really bring you to the subject and bring you alive via, communicating a story. I think it's very different than sort of just the rote facts, because I think another, interesting, little juxtaposition you can make about history is that, in a lot of subjects too, when you're learning them in public school, things might have changed. It's been a while actually now since I've been there, but you're given the textbooks and you're given sort of facts. But I think in universities you're encouraged to dig into more personalized stories as opposed to like, here's a snapshot of 10 different stories and they all have dates and you have to memorize them. The test is on Sunday.
You're more encouraged to ask the big questions and think about what is at stake. I think that's interesting. There's always a struggle, right? Because you have to know a certain amount of just data to sort of get your foot in the door and sort of understand what's happening. But then the question is, so what? What's the point, right? Like, is there an antiquitarian sort of desire to just preserve history, to just preserve the past? Or, like you said, to sort of give something to bring the person to it, right? So ask the big questions of, how does language shape religion, right? I feel like that's a question that, is much more approachable than sort of saying, okay, now we're going to learn about vernacular poets in India. The vernacular poets in India, you already have to be interested in language, you already have to be interested in India. But when you're saying language and religion, it's I think a lot more people can sort of get interested in that. And I think it's the storytelling. I mean, as human beings, we like narrative, right? Like before every sort of election, everyone comes out with like an autobiography, right? You talk about crafting a narrative for different electoral candidates, right? What's whether it's criticism that people make, say Hillary Clinton, that the narrative is that it's her time, right? Or there's narrative of the past. We work in narratives. So I think storytelling it's key to history. I think that, and it's one of the sort of really good tools that it has, because we all love a good story. So then you reach into history and find good stories to sort of illustrate your argument. But yeah, I think storytelling is a really important component of the discipline.
Oh yeah, especially when you stay interested in other ways, and you make the subject active with research or different questions. Is there anything particularly intrigued by these days? Like anything that really stands out to you that you've read recently, whether in your own research or?
So there are two sort of kind of questions that I've been interested in recently. Disconnected question. I mean, they're connected in the sense that they connect the history of Islam in South Asia with the broader world. But the first question has been the question of slavery. Slavery in this Islamic world has, gotten some attention, but it's still a field that really requires more research. And so my own research has been interested in the way in which sort of elite slavery functioned in India and Iran, and I think there's some. I think it's a topic that we can all that we should. It tends to be elided over sometimes, right? And it was a phenomenon that was widespread. So the question is sort of what did that phenomenon feel like or look like? And, I think that's been something that's been of interest to me. The other question that's been of interest to me is the sort of relationship between what I consider the Islamic holy lands of Mecca and Medina, and people's religious experiences and life in faraway places such as India. And so, nowadays there is, with the rise of sort of the power of petrodollars, Indian, South Asian laborers working in the Middle East, there's been sort of, I would say there's been definitely a lot of engagement between South Asian populations and sort of the Islam practiced and propagated in the Arabian Peninsula or the Gulf. And so I've been interested in the history of that, and so the history of that for colonialism and for sort of rise of oil money and migrant labor. So, what was that relationship like in the 16th and 17th century when you had pilgrims going to these sites? So that's been another question that I've been recently interested in. And that sort of that fits into this broader interest again of, how did Muslims in South Asia, make space for themselves there? Sort of creation of like sacred space in South Asia.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, especially with the, speaking of like why we study history. I mean, these days there's so much going on in different parts of the world that we're now aware of, thanks to the media and educational sources and globalization. And definitely when you talk about slavery in these contexts, one of the things that pops into my mind is just the not exactly slavery, but the treatment of workers and building the empires of the future, whether it's in Dubai or
absolutely. I think there's. I think there is, I think this is a trend in history everywhere is that to rethink the sort of also sort of like to query purity, right? So to sort of write a history of Europe that actually includes groups that we didn't include, or to write a history of the Middle East including groups that we didn't release, or if you're writing a history of, for instance, the States of America, how much space does slavery take up in it, or how much space does First Nations people take up in it. And I think, for instance, in the history of South Asia, you had a lot of migration from the Gulf, and you had also a lot of the slaves who were brought in from Africa. But that history isn't really told in histories of South Asia courses as much, So I think the challenging sort of challenging sort of narratives by writing more inclusive histories. I think that speaks to today, right? Because today we sort of think of, what is the space of migrants, for instance, or if you're talking about this rhetoric of "Make America Great Again," or to sort of restore some sort of racial purity in France, for instance. Well, was there ever one? Was there ever? Did you really have this sort of pristine, homogeneous society, or was it always heterogeneous? And if it was always heterogeneous, then you're not having a crisis of diversity. You're just having an economic crisis, or a political crisis, or a crisis of confidence in your political elites or your economic elites. So that's what, and I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier about identity, too.
Oh yeah, especially interesting issues inside of recent political identity formations, because that's another one of the amazing things about studying history is you realize these trends and similarities in societies about how people form identities, and about how 1,000 years ago it's not like racism didn't exist, or colonialism didn't exist, or like migration didn't exist, but mapping out these trends can help us maybe understand the phenomenon of today.
I think it's important that we never sort of we don't romanticize the past, but we sort of if you always had migration, then you look at the different histories of migration. And so I'm currently a colleague of mine and I are putting together a series of articles on Iranian migration to India in the early modern period. And what's interesting is different kinds of issues that come up, or it's interesting because you have Iranian immigrants who came to sort of India, and they had debates about language purity, about Persian and stuff, but then you also had other Iranians or Persians who completely assimilated and sort of patronized vernacular languages. So I think to sort of keep stock of that diversity of experience, it's interesting to me.
Oh yeah, I know. So you find a lot of your research and ideas come up when you're dealing with the news and popular culture, whether it's with a Trump or something else, or do you see the relevance and practicality of the ideas of your subject popping out in all these places? Is that a direction you're thinking, or where do you see the sort of value, if someone wants to put that question?
I think what's happening today, it manifests, the sort of the issue of sort of migration will manifest differently in different places and over the years, but at the core of it, it's the issue of, the issue is the same, it's migration, right? Or the issue is still about maybe cultural hegemony or maintaining some sort of cultural purity. So in that sense, I kind of feel like it's a continuum, right? And so to me, it's kind of interesting. I was recently watching this documentary that was made based on this book. It's called White Mughals by this author William Dalrymple, and it's about in the late 18th century, one of the representatives of the British East India Company that comes to India. It's about his life in this princely state of Hyderabad and how he balanced the expectations of him as I think he was English, or I think he was English. I'm not sure whether he was Scottish or not. I think he was English. The expectations of him as an agent of this trading company, as an Englishman, but also someone who had been born in India, who had gone back to England for education, then come back to India, spoke, I think he spoke Tamil, he composed poetry, he understood Persian, he knew Urdu, he gets married to sort of petty nobility, a woman from a noble background, has kids, and so that kind of very contingent life, I think is something it's of interest to people. I mean, you think about expats or sort of Europeans or North Americans who live in the Middle East or South Asia or elsewhere, or vice versa. Wherever you live somewhere else, how do you sort of how do you create a cultural identity that's authentic to your experiences, and then also meets demands that are put on you by society?
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah, that's especially interesting in terms of the blending of different cultures. Yeah, because there's definitely like the older idea of encounter, like the first encounters people have, through different travel or colonization or just territorial war or whatever that encounter may be. But these days, the blending of that example seems very interesting, and I imagine there are a lot of other interesting cultural examples where understanding how someone could fit into this society could really lend a lot of insights to understanding how like a place like Scarborough could work, where you have different people, different backgrounds, classes.
I think this goes back to the earlier question you asked. Is migration is also a product of empire, right? Migration is also a product of either conquest or movement or incorporation to economic systems. So, for instance, you have indentured workers who were sent from India to the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean they came to Canada. Or because of the British Empire, you had sort of Indians going to South Asians going to Africa, to the UK, and then the economic model meant that South Asians started coming to Canada. So on the one hand, people can study migration from the perspective of these big issues: global capital, conquest, empire, and when we're thinking of, say, Americans living in sort of in Saudi Arabia or the Gulf, who are part of an economic empire, like a sort of these compounds that are essentially these communities which are there to support oil companies, for instance, or the American bases all over, and the sort of intelligence networks and all that sort of entails. So there's all of that. But then the question that I'm kind of more interested in is then, what is personal experiences like? So like you said, like thinking about how a place like Scarborough can work, or how a place can work. Thinking about bigger questions of global capital are important, but also are identity negotiation, multilingualism. So I think sort of the social and cultural sort of add an interesting dimension to these questions. hopefully it's of interest to people.
Yeah. Have you had so you were born or you grew up in?
Yeah, so I was.
What are your experiences?
Yeah, so I was born in Pakistan, and then I came to Canada when I was 17, and I migrated here, and I went to CEGEP, which is in Quebec. It's like grade 12 and 13, so to say. As you finish high school at grade 11, and then you do a 2-year program, and then you enter university. So I did CEGEP, and then I lived in Montreal for 9 years, and that was also interesting to live in Quebec. Primarily because it was this moment of, I came there in 2002, so you're far away from the referendum that you. I think the last referendum was 95, right? Separation. Yeah, so it was a long way, but there was, there was a search for what is Quebec identity. Is it French language, or, as it evolved under, when I left Quebec to come to Ontario, there was this whole charter debates about, whether civil servants could wear hijabs or kippas or what have you, the place of religion, right? Yeah. In the public sphere. That was very interesting, right? And so, that also shaped my sort of interest in these questions, because I think we tend to think, oddly enough, I think we tend to think that religion is really something that happens elsewhere. Right, like you have religion. Like religion is important in the Middle East. Religion is important in South Asia, but people don't take seriously that religion is important in North America. Whether it's in the States, which is surprising to me, given the rhetoric in the States about war on Christmas when Starbucks changes its cup, or whether it's movements against women's issues of women's reproductive rights, or gay marriage. Religion is very much there, and it's very much there in state legislatures. But people, when people think of religious issues, they always think of it as just Islam.
Yeah,
right.
Just like the caliphate or something. It's over there.
Yeah, because religion in the States is institutionalized, and the same thing in Canada. I feel like here religion doesn't play as big a role, perhaps. But when this whole charter debates were happening in Quebec. There was this idea that Catholicism had some sort of legitimacy. So it was okay to have, the cross on top of Montreal, or to have the cross in National Assembly, because it's just cultural, versus the hijab or so on and so forth is somehow impeding on secularism, on the idea of secular or equality. And of course, France is like the key case for this, right? I think they're the epicenter of this issue, where so that's interesting to me.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I've always it's been a pretty enduring interest for me too, like exploring my identity as sort of
what's your
my sort of,
yes. my
labels. So I grew up. I describe my household as sort of apathetic Protestant,
right?
Like no attachment to religion or whatever, no Bible, but the marriages and like funerals and some family get-togethers. We have this sort of Protestant or context.
Yes.
And then in university, I started exploring these different labels. Yeah. And I got involved with the Moral Atheist group, which was a lot of fun, just building community in a secular way. Yeah. Later changing names to humanist groups and just trying to find ways to, build community across human variables. But there's always been this question for me of what is religion? Is it good? Is it bad? What are the good and bad elements? What is the position of it? And especially as you mentioned, if it's state-sanctioned religion, especially in Canada, where we have, state-funded Catholic or province-funded Catholic schools, they're seen as just sort of cultural and in some way still secular. Meanwhile, like, oh, a Muslim school or oh, a mosque on the street is this different, weird religion.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, if you think about it, look, if you see our national holidays, I mean, there's a historical precedent for it and makes complete sense, and also the geographic population that you have Christmas off, you have Easter off, and I think in there, from the legal point of view and the policy point of view, I think it's very progressive, or it's very good that all religious holidays are recognized, or what have you. But in sort of like when the discourse gets nasty, that's always seen as some sort of great concession that's gone too far.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, well, you already have a concession.
Yeah, it wasn't already
exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's really brought up this issue of community, because I think that sorry. I forget where I was reading this, but there was a congregation. There was an atheist congregation that would meet every Sunday, and they were talking about the fact that it's the rituals of religious communities, and so that is something still that is very powerful, right? Even if it's operating in a atheistic intellectual space. And I think that's really important. I think the rise of religious student organizations, or on campus, whether it's Muslim student organization, or Hindu students organization, or Protestant students organizations, there's something about building community. Like, I think community seems to be key. It's very interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely. In my own personal journey through these interesting issues, I've, depending on how good or bad I've been at managing friends over the years, I think it's important to have some form of community. And as I was just getting into like the moral atheist group and lifestyle, first of all, it's kind of ironic, because atheism isn't really a celebration of anything. It's more the absence of something. And then, like, sort of terminology wise, humanism or rationalism is like the establishing of values that you hope can be universal. But over the years, I've just gone to take a more wider view and not see religion as this monolithic piece of ideology, but it's it's different cultural practices woven into people's lives in different ways. And I think it's sort of called like the new atheists, like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and those folks, who would just their habit is more so to outwardly just criticize religion. And then you have the more like atheism 2.0, Alain de Botton and some other researchers who are still very secular, but they love digging into the anthropology or the sociology or just the cultural psychology of different religious traditions, and how there's just a lot of community building value, whether it's in establishing morals, establishing norms, togetherness, and definitely like Sunday meetings for atheists or other different like Unitarian ventures. I think there's, for a lot of people, there's definitely going to be some value, especially if they're moving away from a religion.
What you just said sparked something in my mind, which is religion's not really going anywhere in a way. Like, I just saw somebody post this the other day about how atheism's on the rise. I think it sort of said that they had done some sort of model, mathematical model, and they sort of said, atheism's going to be the predominant religious expression, non-expression in 5 countries by 2020 or 2030 or something. But by and large, religion isn't going anywhere. And so we have to somehow be able to engage with that if we're going to coexist. Yeah. Right? And then the other thing that sort of came up is, like what you just said, it's we tend to think of the religious other, as a monolithic entity, but as soon as you go into it, you realize that there is so much diversity within it. And I don't want to say it has so much diversity as just to pay lip service to diversity is a good thing.
The name drop.
Yeah, but when you go into it, you realize you're like, oh, you just can't make broad statements, right? And the main tradition that I study is Islam, and so it's always interesting to me because who really gets to the vision of Islam that people have, who gets to represent it, right? Or what gets represented as part of it is really interesting. So we'll have this is, I'm trying to think what the best way to phrase this. You'll have in labeling something as Islamist or Islamic, there's a certain political action that's taking place, right? And then labeling other stuff as just cultural, right, is I think there's something operating there. So for instance, if you say poetry created by Muslims in the medieval period is not actually Islamic, it's cultural, then you're taking away an aesthetic tradition from it, right? And so ultimately, to me, it's like there's a whole breadth of experience that is encompassed or carried out by Muslims or Hindus or what have you, and you just kind of have to take it all together. I think that's the key. So you can't, I think you can't write off sort of painful histories of violence, and you shouldn't do that, right? And you need to think about how, for instance, people who are engaging in violence, what kind of claim are they making to the tradition, right? So, for instance, one of the issues that keeps coming up with some of the Islamic terrorism or sort of the violence that's happening is that if you look at some Muslim jurisprudence, there's no basis for those kinds of violent acts, right? But they're making some kind of other claim to it, right? And so then what do you, as when you're looking at it from an observer point of view, it's more helpful, I think, to think, okay, they're making some sort of claim to the religion based on either rhetorical strategies or historical antecedents or what have you. And they're not making it through a jurisprudential or legal point of view. And so the whole anxiety about Sharia then goes away, right? Versus if people are talking about family law in Muslim societies, then Sharia is much more in the picture, right? So I think when it comes to religion, when people say, "Oh, it's just dogma, it's just or it's ideology," well, yeah, it starts off with this belief in in a divine. But then people construct political philosophy, people construct legal systems, and they are fairly elaborated, right? And so then let's engage with those rather than just bracketing it off and being like, oh, we can't deal with this because this is like religion, right? And I think, I sort of think that's interesting. Too.
Oh yeah, really interesting, engaging point. Yeah, so I'd love to ask you if you want the last, my big final stereotypical question is if you don't have any other comments or concerns you'd like to bring up.
No, I'm looking forward to this question now.
Okay, so it's my challenging question.
Yes.
If you had to give a 30-second speech to the world, what would it be?
Oh gosh. That's an interesting one.
I think it's a fun psychology question at the least.
I love to discuss your analysis of the different people who asked this question too. Okay, What I would sort of say is that I think that we sometimes have this idea that there's a hierarchy of worldviews, or there is a straight line towards progress of some sort. But you know, there's no straight narrative about human existence, and you know, people may live very fundamentally different lives from you, and that's okay. In a way, we have to sort of come to terms with that people are going to live very fundamentally different lives from one another, and perhaps that is a good thing, that we don't that we don't globally go into groupthink. I think certain things that it would be nice if we globally put more emphasis on education, on health, certain sort of things that I think most people would agree with, for the most part. But it's good that that we maintain some sort of diversity in thought, because there's no certitude that we are right. Right? I mean, we may be going horribly awry, whether it's climate change or sort of like certain economic models of investment or what have you, right? So it's good that we have some diversity, so we don't globally go off the deep end. And then just rethink certitude. Like that is what I would say. That'd be my. That was more than 30 seconds.
It's always more than 30 seconds. Nice.
All right, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, it's really interesting.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having this interview.
It was a pleasure. Okay, well, take care.
Take care.